Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive today.
Hi.
We're going to be tackling some really interesting research on canine epilepsy
Right.
and how antiseizure drugs can have some pretty fascinating effects.
Interesting.
We're diving into a recent article from Veterinary Record
Okay.
called Caregiver-reported increased food motivation and adiposity in dogs receiving antiseizure drugs.
Sounds pretty dense.
It is, but it's super relevant for a lot of dog owners out there.
Yeah, I can see that.
Basically, this study is looking at whether that increased appetite side effect that we hear so much about with dogs on these medications can actually be measured scientifically, and if it's really contributing to weight gain.
Makes sense. Yeah, a lot of owners probably wonder about that.
Definitely.
Right.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you give us a quick overview of idiopathic epilepsy in dogs?
Sure. So idiopathic epilepsy, or IE, is like the most common chronic neurological issue we see in dogs.
Wow.
Basically means they have seizures, but we can't find any specific reason for them.
So like not a tumor or an infection.
Exactly. It's not something else causing it.
So it's kind of diagnosis of exclusion.
Pretty much. And because we don't know the root cause, managing IE usually involves long-term treatment with antiseizure drugs.
Or ASDs, as we'll call them.
Yep, to help control those seizures.
And this is where the whole food motivation thing comes in, right?
Yeah, a lot of owners say their dogs become like bottomless pits after starting these medications.
Exactly. Yeah. So this study wanted to move beyond those anecdotal reports and actually quantify it.
Okay.
They used something called the food motivation score.
Interesting.
Which comes from a validated questionnaire called DORA.
DORA.
Yeah, it stands for Dog Obesity Risk Assessment.
Oh, that makes sense.
So tell me, how did they actually study this?
Well, they had two groups of dogs.
Okay.
First group was 222 dogs with IE who were on ASDs.
Right.
And the second group was a control group.
Gotcha.
7,086 healthy dogs.
Wow, that's a pretty big control group.
Yeah, they wanted to make sure they had a solid comparison.
And they were careful about the breeds in that control group too, right?
Absolutely. They made sure to include breeds that are commonly diagnosed with IE.
Like border collies.
Exactly. So they could really isolate the effects of the medication.
Make sure it wasn't just a breed-specific thing.
Exactly. So they're comparing apples to apples.
So what they find, was there a big difference between the groups?
Oh, yeah. The results were pretty clear.
Okay.
The dogs with IE on ASDs had way higher food motivation scores.
Compared to those healthy pups.
Right. It really validated what so many owners have been saying.
That these meds really make dogs want to eat more.
It seems so.
So even when owners are trying to be careful about their dog's weight, they're fighting an uphill battle.
Sounds like it.
The study found that owners of epileptic dogs were actually putting in more effort to manage their dog's food and weight.
Really?
Yeah, they were aware of the issue and trying to address it. But even so, those epileptic dogs still ended up with a significantly higher body condition score.
So they were still heavier?
Yeah, compared to the healthy dogs.
Wow. So just cutting back on food might not be enough.
It seems that way.
We might need a different approach to manage weight in these dogs on ASDs.
Now, I'm curious, did they look at whether epilepsy itself could be a factor even without the meds?
They tried to.
Okay.
But there just weren't enough drug-naive epileptic dogs in the study.
Meaning dogs who had epilepsy but weren't yet on medication?
Exactly. Only 8 of them.
Oh, wow.
So it's hard to say for sure.
Whether the epilepsy itself has an impact.
Yeah, it's tricky to separate the effects.
I see. But for the dogs who are on medication, did they look at whether taking one drug versus multiple drugs made a difference?
Yeah, they did. They didn't find a statistically significant difference.
Between dogs on just one ASD?
Right, monotherapy.
And those on multiple ASDs?
Yeah, polytherapy. But there's an interesting trend within those findings.
Okay, I'm all ears.
The more ASDs a dog was taking, the more likely their owner was to report things like decreased energy and coordination, increased hunger, of course.
Nice.
And while it wasn't statistically significant, there was a slight connection between more drugs and a higher body condition score.
So more meds could potentially mean more problems.
It's a possibility.
But could they pinpoint a specific drug as the main culprit?
Unfortunately, not really. That's the tricky thing about polytherapy. It's hard to isolate the effects of each drug.
When they're all mixed together.
Exactly.
So it's a big tangled web.
It can be, but they did notice that phenobarbital, the most common ASD in the study, was also the one most frequently linked to those reported side effects.
But like you said, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Right.
If more dogs are on a particular drug,
yeah,
you're just naturally going to see more side effects from it.
Exactly.
Even if other drugs are involved too.
Right. It's a complex picture.
Definitely. And it's not just about the drugs themselves, right?
Sure.
It's also about how owners are managing their dog's epilepsy.
Exactly. For example, the study found that most owners were using treats to give medication.
Oh, yeah. That's super common.
It's much easier than wrestling with a pill.
For sure. Makes everyone's life easier.
Right. But those treats are extra calories.
And potentially multiple times a day.
Exactly. And the study found that a third of the owners weren't adjusting their dog's regular meals.
To account for those extra treat calories.
Right. So even with the best intentions,
those treats could be adding up.
Absolutely. It's a sneaky source of extra weight gain.
So it seems like there's a lot more to consider here.
Definitely.
Especially when it comes to the psychological side of things.
Yeah, there's a whole other layer there.
Epilepsy itself can be super stressful for dogs.
I can only imagine.
Just think about experiencing those repeated seizures.
Right.
It's got to take a toll on their mental well-being.
It makes sense.
And then when you add on those potential side effects from meds,
Yeah.
lethargy, discomfort, it's like a recipe for chronic stress.
It really is. And there's more and more evidence that dogs, just like us, can turn to food.
To cope with stress.
Exactly. It's like stress eating for pups.
So a dog with epilepsy is already stressed by their condition,
Right.
and then the meds might make them even hungrier.
And more likely to seek comfort in food.
It's a vicious cycle.
It can be. So we really need to look at both the physical and psychological sides of this issue.
For sure. Now, you mentioned that this study also looked at owner perceptions
Okay.
of their dog's weight and activity levels.
Yeah.
What'd they find there?
It was interesting, actually. Owners of epileptic dogs were more likely to accurately assess their dog's lower activity levels.
So they knew their dogs weren't as active.
Exactly. And they also recognized that their dogs might be overweight.
So they weren't in denial?
No, not really. But they were still having a tough time managing it.
Despite their best efforts.
Yeah, there's a disconnect there. The study found that owners were really trying
stricter feeding schedules, limiting access to food.
Exactly. All the right things.
But those epileptic dogs were still heavier
than the healthy control group.
So it's like they were doing everything they could, but it still wasn't enough.
Right. It shows just how powerful that increased food motivation can be.
So even with awareness and effort,
it's a real challenge.
That brings us to the burning question then.
Okay.
How do you manage that food motivation when medication is constantly driving their hunger?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's no easy answer.
I figured as much.
Dietary restriction is the first step, of course.
But this study shows it's often not enough.
Especially with all those treats for giving medication.
Exactly.
So we need to think outside the box a bit.
Are there other strategies that might help?
There are some promising avenues.
Like what?
Well, we know certain types of fiber can make dogs feel fuller.
So incorporating high-fiber foods
could be helpful,
even with that increased hunger from medication.
Exactly. It's not just about how much they eat, but what they eat.
And what about the behavioral side of things?
Right. Remember our chat about stress eating?
Yeah.
Managing stress could potentially help with food motivation, too.
So if you can reduce their overall stress,
they might not be as driven to seek comfort in food.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
How do you even begin to manage stress in a dog with epilepsy, though?
Well, a calm and predictable environment is key.
Okay.
And enrichment activities that don't involve food.
So like puzzle toys or playtime.
Exactly. And even things like massage or gentle touch can help.
It's about looking at the whole picture.
Absolutely. And of course, exercise is important too.
Even for dogs who might be lethargic from their meds.
Even then, it doesn't have to be intense.
Just short walks or play sessions.
Right. And swimming can be good for dogs who have trouble moving around.
A lower impact.
Exactly. It's all about finding what works for each dog.
This is all really helpful.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else from the study that stands out to you?
One thing that's important to keep in mind is that this study relied on what owners reported.
So there's potential for bias there.
Exactly. Owners might not always be accurate about their dog's food intake.
Or how much exercise they're really getting.
Right. So while the findings are important,
we should take them with a grain of salt.
Exactly. We need more research to confirm these findings in a more controlled setting.
Maybe studies that can actually measure food intake.
Exactly. This is a great starting point.
But we need to dig deeper.
Absolutely. And explore those long-term effects of ASDs on weight and metabolism.
It's about finding better ways to help these dogs.
And their owners, too.
Because this impacts the human side of the equation as well.
Big time. It's not just the dog going through this.
It's the owner who's worried about their dog.
Managing the meds.
Trying to prevent seizures.
And now potentially dealing with weight gain, too.
It can be a lot to handle.
It really can.
It's got to be tough for owners to see their dog like that.
Yeah.
Always hungry, maybe dealing with side effects.
Right.
And then their body starts changing because of the weight gain.
It's hard.
Especially when they're already doing everything they can.
Exactly. And it still doesn't seem to be enough.
It's a really tough spot for those owners.
It is, and it shows just how important it is to support them.
Absolutely.
We need to provide more resources and help for owners of epileptic dogs.
Beyond just the medical care for the dog itself.
Exactly. It's about emotional support, too.
And practical guidance.
Right, because they're the ones navigating this whole journey.
And vets are really on the front lines of this.
Oh, absolutely. They're not just prescribing meds.
They're educating owners about potential side effects.
Right.
Offering tips for managing weight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a huge part of their role.
That compassionate and understanding support.
It makes a world of difference.
But there's also a need for more specialized resources, right?
Definitely. Like support groups, specifically for owners of epileptic dogs.
Where they can connect with people who really get it.
Exactly. It can be so helpful to share experiences and advice.
And just feel less alone.
Absolutely.
It's a good reminder that veterinary medicine is not just about treating animals.
It's about the human-animal bond.
Recognizing how interconnected our well-being is.
Well said.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
Yes.
Into anti-seizure drugs and food motivation in dogs.
We've covered a lot.
I hope our listeners have a better understanding now.
I hope so, too.
Of just how complex it can be to manage this condition.
It's not a quick fix.
Definitely not. But with knowledge awareness.
And some creativity.
We can help these dogs live their best lives.
Absolutely.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there from Vet NeuroJar, keep those minds-inspired hearts light and tails wagging.